The United States of America is famous for its collection of 50 states, and it's not often questioned how or when these territories became part of the country. We know there were the original 13 colonies, but after that, many people tend to jump ahead to when 13 became 50. In doing so, we miss some fascinating events in the history of the United States and Russia. Before Alaska became a state, it was a U.S. territory. But before it was a U.S. territory, it was under the Russian crown. It was the Russians who sold what is now the largest U.S. state to the Americans. So, how and why did this happen? Back in the 17th century, a Russian explorer named Semyon Dezhnev set out to discover whether Siberia was connected to or near North America. There are conflicting accounts of what happened during his expedition, and the Russian government never received any definitive findings from it. Hoping to finally answer the question, in the early 18th century, Tsar Peter the Great sent another expedition. This time, two men, Vitus Bering and Alexei Chirikov, set sail on a joint mission to find the northwestern coast of North America. By mid-July 1741, both ships had sighted land and soon turned back toward Russia to report their discoveries. Chirikov and his crew returned successfully, but Bering's ship was wrecked. He died of illness before his crew could build a new vessel and eventually make their way back to Russia. The crew members brought with them high-quality sea otter pelts obtained from the newfound land, which sparked immense interest among Russian traders back home and planted the idea of settling the Alaskan territory. Initially, Russian traders established hunting and trading posts along the Aleutian Islands to support the long and challenging trade routes to and from Russia. Over time, these posts grew into settlements. This shift toward a colonial model led to mixed treatment of the native Alaskans. The Russian settlers' determination to establish a fur trade monopoly resulted in the exploitation of and frequent violent conflicts with the local populations. Despite this, the Russians continued to expand their commercial operations and territorial claims throughout Alaska, primarily along the coasts, during the latter half of the 1700s. As the 19th century began, the Russian-American Company was established after Nikolai Petrovich Rezanov secured a fur trade monopoly from the Tsar. The company's goal, agreed upon by Rezanov and Tsar Paul I, was not only commercial, but also to expand Russia's colonial efforts. The company did just that, even establishing Fort Ross in California and Fort Elizabeth in the Kingdom of Hawaii. At first, things seemed promising for the Russian settlers, but the situation deteriorated rapidly before the mid-1800s. First, the settlements were small, often comprising only a few hundred Russians in total. The Russian capital was too distant from Alaska, making communication and travel between them difficult and slow. Compounding these issues, the Russian-American Company entered a period plagued by mismanagement and poor business practices. Together, these factors caused a drastic decline in profits from the Alaskan territories, forcing the Russians to rely on trade with the nearby British and Americans. Finally, the Crimean War was the last straw. With the Alaskan settlement already struggling and financially draining, the war's sudden expenses doomed any prospects of revitalizing the Russian-American Company. Russia needed a new strategy to avoid a complete and costly failure as it tried to rein in its territorial ambitions. At this time, Russia was deeply concerned about British intentions. Tensions between the global powers were high following the Crimean War, and the Russians quickly realized their Alaskan colony was in a precarious position. The territory was extremely difficult to defend due to its great distance from the Russian capital and mainland. The British were right across the border in Canada, giving them easy access if they wanted to seize it. Given the hostile relations with Britain and Russia's warmer ties with the United States, selling the land to the Americans began to seem like an excellent option. Believing that American control of Alaska could counter British dominance in the region and reduce the threat to Russia, Tsar Alexander II decided it was time to make an offer. The Russian government began these discussions in the 1850s. The Russians formally presented the offer to the Americans, but with the American Civil War brewing, Washington was too preoccupied to give it serious consideration. Nonetheless, Russia remained determined, and the proposal had its supporters. Back in 1848, U.S. Secretary of State William Seward had declared, "Our population is destined to roll resistless waves to the ice barriers of the North, and to encounter Oriental civilization on the shores of the Pacific, making the U.S. stance on expansion quite clear." So, Russian officials continued discussions with their American counterparts over the next few years. After the Union victory ended the Civil War in 1865, the Russian offer finally became a priority. Secretary of State Seward eagerly entered negotiations with the Russians in the spring of 1867. After some negotiation on the price, both sides agreed on the stunningly low sum of $7.2 million for the entire territory. On March 30, 1867, the final treaty was signed, and Alaska became American. Ironically, the Russian and American press were not enthusiastic about the deal initially. Russian newspapers criticized the sale of a colony they had invested so much effort in and profited from, while American newspapers argued the opposite, mockingly referring to Alaska as nothing more than an icebox. Of course, the latter would soon realize how wrong their preconceived notions were, but at the time, the deal was championed primarily by the politicians involved. Some sources state that Native Alaskans were relieved to be free from harsh Russian rule, though this was not true freedom but merely an exchange of power, even if U.S. control brought an improvement in conditions. After the sale, the Klondike Gold Rush at the end of the 19th century triggered a wave of gold miners flocking to the new Alaskan territory. The so-called icebox was quickly transforming into a jackpot. American profits from Alaska skyrocketed, and this was only the beginning of the discovery of the territory's natural resources. Today, Alaska's annual gross product is typically around $50 billion. Oil and other resources remain abundant within its borders, and the state has no sales tax or state income tax. Furthermore, its strategic location is a significant bonus for military defense, placing the U.S. in a much safer position than if Alaska had remained Russian territory. So, with so many benefits for the Americans and relatively little gain for the Russians in comparison, why did Russia sell Alaska to the United States? The simplest answer is money. Maintaining an overseas territory so far from the capital and so close to rivals was both risky and expensive. While it was initially profitable, poor management and the persistent challenges of travel and communication between Russia and Alaska led to the economic collapse of the Russian-American company. The added financial strain of the Crimean War made it impossible to continue expanding or even retaining the colony. It was time for Russia to leave, to avoid a potential military disaster if the British attacked and to salvage its finances while it still could. Furthermore, allowing the U.S. to expand so close to British territory would help neutralize the threat to Russia and hopefully strengthen the friendly ties between the two nations. Given all these factors and the eventual enthusiasm from American officials, it's clear why Russia was not just willing but eager to sell, and why they specifically chose America as the buyer. While it may seem in hindsight like a poor decision or even a shady deal by the Americans, it's evident that Russia had several valid reasons for the sale. And apparently, America had a lucky streak when it came to gold and oil.